Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And yes, we are here for another session of the AfriLabs Hot Learning Week Special Edition. Quick feedback I know is that everybody enjoyed yesterday's session, and I would want to say thank you again to Lusanda. But yeah, we have today is another day. Before we continue, I would want to thank the sponsors. So, as you know, the AfriLabs Hubs Learning Week is under the AfriLabs Capacity Building Program, which is a 36-month program focused on improving the capacity of hubs across the continent. So we want to thank the French Development Agency and yeah, we want to thank them for this opportunity and want to thank the team at the Secretariat for this. Today's topic is going to be on incubation models that support startups move from idea to real product and develop celebrity products and services, and it's going to be taken by Takunda. So Takunda is the founder of the Village Innovation Network, which is a support network that focuses on innovation and technology and its ability to empower organizations and community to entrepreneurship. Oh, Takunda is also the board member of AfriLabs, which she recently joined. But yeah, we're excited to have him on the board. So yeah, Takunda, over to you now, and please stay tuned. We have announcements coming up. Remember to take part in the survey we'll be sharing, and feel free to send in your questions at any time. We'll take note of that and make sure that Takunda gets them. Takunda, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kenny. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us here for this session. I hope it's going to be an amazing session. The topic is very interesting. It's something that we focus on as entrepreneurship support organizations, as hubs across the continent and across the world. Let me just start the presentation. Great. So, moving to where we are starting. Great. So, this is me, and this is kind of the topic. The idea really in today's session is to try and talk about kind of the practical elements in trying to run an incubation model. And I wanted to take this from the perspective of the ESO, the hub, in terms of how we structured the program in the first place. And then trying to unpack that and a couple of the elements that go through that. So my presentation is going to be broken down into four parts, basically. The first part will explore the different types of incubation models very briefly, and then move into the key ingredients that I believe have to be there and elements that we need to focus on in building these incubation models with the intention of supporting startups to become sellable and getting to actual markets. The third part will be about mapping out and building an incubation model value chain, which is something that we started considering, I think, just maybe the last year. We'd always just focused on what we were doing and what our program was about, and didn't really sort of understand what the program and how it could fit into a larger ecosystem. And then the fourth part of the presentation will focus on storytelling and how to effectively do that for our program and our participants, and also to talk about measuring program impact and a couple of ideas that I have in that particular space. The session is targeting hub owners and managers, so people who are running hubs or running co-working spaces, who are running entrepreneurship organizations. And we know that there are different types and hybrids of these organizations. We're also looking at people who are running and managing programs, so program executives and managers, people who are coordinating associations and networks. We have a lot of associations coming up to support SMEs and startups across the continent, as well as the support teams in the incubation programs. So people who are doing the M&E, our mentors, our content managers, that entire back office team that's behind our programs. At the end of this session, I hope that we would have been able to understand the different types of incubation models that we can take up, and how to focus on the intended outputs and the objectives of those programs, to identify the key ingredients in designing and implementing successful models, as well as identifying resources that we can use in designing and implementing incubation programs. Sorry. So when we talk about incubation, and this is always a very interesting conversation to have, because when you look at the definitions of what this thing is, it is always variable. I like to think that incubation focuses on the growth aspect and building capacity for growth within the startups that we're working with. So incubation models or programs don't necessarily, or primarily focus on the ideation process of finding ideas, trying to figure out what that looks like. And ideally, they shouldn't focus on the rapid scaling of solutions, because that in itself is actual acceleration. There is a very big gap between having an idea that has a potential market and has a particular product and moving that into an actual entity that has the capacity to grow and scale. And I know we can, have a back and forth around the definition of what incubation is, incubation versus acceleration, and all of these, different conversations. And I always like to try and contextualize this, right? So when you go online, and I did this as I was researching for this topic, right? And I tried to understand what incubation looked like in Africa. And I realized that this concept is not necessarily new to our communities and our ecosystems. The idea of creating a conducive environment, a conducive space that has the tools, the resources, the content, and the support for something to grow, for something to develop the capacity to grow. And so maybe as we go through this entire presentation, this entire session, it's something that we need to think about to say, what does incubation, yes, firstly look like in Africa? But more importantly, what does it look like within our local ecosystems? Because the way that startups and SMEs are incubated in developed markets in Silicon Valley isn't the same way that they're supported and incubated on the continent. And more importantly, how incubation works in more established ecosystems like in Kenya or in South Africa isn't exactly the same way that it's going to work in more nascent ecosystems like in Zimbabwe. So being able to contextualize this to our very real environment is important. And so when we look at incubation in Africa, there are a couple of factors that we need to kind of think about, right? The first being the level of complexity of the ecosystem. And so for myself, I've been working in this innovation space for somewhere between 6 to 9 years. And in this entire process here in Zimbabwe, in Bulawayo, we've kind of gone through different models of how do we, help people find the best ideas, and then moving from how do we help, people with the great ideas build teams that can support the growth of, products and services. And I remember in 2015, I was so excited with the progress that we had made at the time that, I started designing out an entire accelerator program. We were already running an incubation program at the time as the TechVillage. And, we designed this, I wrote a concept note. I even put up a website, which is live to this very day. And then the accelerator was going to be called Velocity. Right? So if you go to velocity.co.zw, you'll actually find the page there. But the one thing I realized was that the ecosystem and the startups that we were supporting at the time weren't anywhere close to needing acceleration, let alone being ready for incubation in itself. And this is kind of because of that level of complexity, the kind of entrepreneurs that you're seeing in your space, their particular needs, right? Is it money that they need at this, given point? And a lot of the times when you're talking about incubation, it's not money that they need at that point in time. It's the capacity to actually grow, the capacity to be able to utilize that money to scale, to truly validate whether the product or service that they're developing has an addressable market over and above whatever they have been able to validate to get to a place where they're breaking even. Incubation programs also vary depending on the focus of the program, right? So the technical complexity of the industry or sector that you're looking at. I've seen a lot of hubs and ESOs, decide to focus on a particular industry. So let's build an incubation model for, the agricultural space or the creative space. And half the time we don't particularly understand the technical requirements of that space. This was very, very real for us in 2018 and 2019 when we worked with City, which is based in Cape Town, to run a biotech incubator. So we were based in Zimbabwe and we were working with a hub in South Africa for this CS funded program. And the biggest challenge that we had there was, first and foremost, as a TechVillage, we'd never run a biotech incubator before, but City had, and they were sort of working on this. And the one thing that we quickly realized by going through this entire program was that the requirements and the needs of the startups that were coming from Zimbabwe were very, very high and very, very technical, to a point where simply providing a co-working space wasn't going to be enough. Providing, the business development services, access to mentors, and all of these particulate elements it dawned on us that the core infrastructure that biotech startups needed within Zimbabwe, which is access to labs, access to equipment, access to the environment in which they can develop, prototype, and go through an entire process of licensing whatever innovative product they've come up with. That entire ecosystem for infrastructure wasn't present, and so trying to build a second version of that program in Zimbabwe, meant that we needed to address those infrastructural issues. And then, over and above that, of course, who's funding the entire, incubation program? Because it's great to kind of talk about the need to provide space, the ecosystem, and all of these nice things, but the kind of thing that, affects whether something happens or not is where the money is coming from. And so even as I, look at potential programs and models for the future, I realize that there's a very basic formula that I kind of have to look at to understand. So, when you look at funding or financing these models, and again, this actually affects whether your program is going to be successful and whether your startups actually get to the market, because different financing partners or funders have different requirements. So whether you're running a bootstrap program where you need to understand the resources that you have and not overcommit to a program and over-promise your participants in terms of what your program is actually able to do. And to be able to do that, you need to very clearly define what your goals are and what your intended outputs are. And these might be very high level, but that allows you to use the means that you have as a hub, to deploy your program. If you're looking at corporate funded incubation models, in our experience, we've worked with a couple of telcos here in Zimbabwe. And one of the things that we realized was, firstly, it kind of depends where the money is coming from the corporate. Is it coming from your more product development oriented, departments, or is it coming from PR? Because a lot of corporates actually just want to be seen to be doing stuff in the innovation space. It's kind of hot and sexy right now. But that also then tells you what their intentions are in getting into this and what those deliverables then look like. And it's important to be able to sort of match that against your intended sort of deliverables. Be very clear about IP. I think we've seen in the media a whole lot of stories about, startup goes and works with corporate X, and then at some point, idea was stolen, or this happened, or this didn't happen, and it gets into an entire legal sort of entanglement, right? It's important that if we're working in corporate funded programs, that we are very clear about what that looks like in terms of, intellectual property. And I think a good number of countries in Africa have some form of IP, framework. It might need a lot of work, which is an opportunity that ESOs, should sort of play a role in. But being very clear about that helps to manage expectations, helps to manage whether or not your startups actually end up exiting that program and getting into the market or not. It also affects what kind of getting into the market that is, right? So it might be getting integrated into, a telco's ecosystem. We did that with one of the MNOs here in Zimbabwe. Their real desire was to get more people using their mobile money service. And that was the thrust. And the different, corporate was really just looking at, can we get really nice ideas that we can just, take up, rebrand, and then call those products ourselves. So being able to identify these differences and clearly communicating them to your startups becomes very, very important. It's again important because when you're dealing with corporate funded sort of models, and I think it was touched on in yesterday's session, that the corporate who's funding you becomes technically your customer. So you're looking at what their objectives are, and your startups kind of become your users. They kind of become a deliverable of the entire sort of program or model. So being able to qualify and communicate these issues becomes very, very important. We're also existing at a time where a lot of players in the donor community are beginning to enter the entrepreneurship space. And I've been part of a couple of conversations around, how traditional NGOs are effectively becoming or looking like they've been redressed to take advantage of the opportunities that are there in this space. And one of the things that came across when we were having conversations with, a couple of donors was that they're looking at entrepreneurship and innovation and enterprise development as a means to achieving an end. So when you look at how their funds are structured, it's important for you to understand what those deliverables might be. A good example would be, maybe a donor that has done a lot of work in supporting, to identify what the cross-cutting issues might be in that particular issue. So they're looking at using entrepreneurship and innovation as a means to address those particular issues. It means even as you design your program, you need to make sure that, yes, you're pushing for enterprise development, you're pushing for startups that are coming in and are moving out, but you are aware that the reason why the funder is working with you is because they want to be able to deliver on these particular issues. So with programs that are developed in established markets that are then brought into countries via country reps, country representatives, being able to contextualize and localize that content to make sure that it is as applicable as possible to the participants that you are kind of working with. Over and above that, it's also looking at whether your incubation model is targeting or focusing on a very specific sector or whether it is agnostic. And again, this speaks to what your ecosystem looks like, right? Initially, we wanted to be very, sector focused. Let's focus on, fintech and develop a model around that. And when we went out into the ecosystem, we realized that there were very, very few, fintech startups that were in the space. And it was because regulation was a challenge. The means and the resources that we needed to try and innovate in that space weren't as available to mainstream innovators in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs in the ecosystem. So we had to look at a more sector agnostic space where you're taking startups in agriculture, in logistics, in waste management, and taking them through an incubation model. So that even affects the kind of content, the kind of activities that you're looking at. And then you have the stage-based model. So what kind of startups are you looking at? At what stage should they be pre-seed, so they've never raised any funding round, and you're trying to run an incubation model that focuses a lot on making sure that they are ready for investment? Or are you looking at startups that have generated revenue to a specific level? So being able to articulate these issues kind of is what drives how to then build your hybrid or very unique model. So figuring out what your financing is going to look like for your model, the sensitivity of your sector. So is it sector specific or is it agnostic? And what stage are you actually targeting in your incubation model kind of helps to define and almost guarantee whether success will be something that you're going to achieve. Now, yesterday the presenter also talked about understanding your why. So why do you do particular programs? Why do you exist as an organization? I think it's important to take that question and move it down your entire sort of food chain, right? So when you're looking at financing of your programs, when you're looking at your donors and all of these different individuals, you need to understand why they are doing this. It's great that they have a request for proposals, that as a hub, you need resources, you need funding for your operation, so you apply for them. But you need to be able to understand what the deliverables are going to be and whether those match up with your internal objectives. When we had conversations, I think it was at the last annual gathering in 2019, the physical one, in Ethiopia. We had a small informal conversation around this, around how people weren't so happy about taking donor funding because it comes with a lot of conditions, right? They need a specific type of reporting. They want specific issues highlighted. And so being able to understand those things and weighing them against your ideals, your objectives and deliverables, is really at the core of making sure that your model becomes successful. Otherwise, you're definitely going to have issues with your financing organization and your stakeholders, whoever you're bringing on board to support your program. But also, more importantly, understanding why the startups are getting into your particular program. And this is something that frustrated us, I think, early on around 2015, 2016. Because we went out and we said to people, we're an innovation hub, we're focusing on tech, and this is great, and this is what we're doing, and we got startups into the program, and we're talking about all these startups, right? And everybody loves, providing coverage, especially when new programs are launched. But then, a year into doing that, the media started asking us, so, where are the startups? What's going on? You guys expect, you always talk about how you're supporting entrepreneurship, you're supporting innovation. Where are the innovators, right? And so we kind of had to take a step back and try and understand what had happened. And understanding that a lot of our young people, our youth, our people who are getting into entrepreneurship, one of the reasons why they're getting into this is because they kind of are looking for opportunities and ways to survive, right? And if we're not sensitive to that and sensitive to the issues around surviving, we are ultimately going to run programs, get great participants who seem very passionate, but a year after the program don't seem to exist in the market. And so, a lot of those questions then come up. In theory, we believe that startups and SMEs and their founders are trying to explore some form of opportunity, that they've gone through the process of ideating and validating their ideas because they're trying to explore an opportunity. But understanding these issues of surviving, of whether they have an income and what that looks like, whether they're able to take care of those bread and butter issues, is something that we need to be able to focus on and address, especially because not all, in fact, very few incubation models provide a financial incentive for participants at the beginning, right? Some that we've looked at provide some sort of seed funding at the end of the program. So how do you make sure that your participants are able to actually go through this? Sometimes it's really about taking a step back and saying, okay, we love the fact that you're getting into this program, but let's design something that addresses these particular issues, these sustainability issues, before we get you into the particular program that we're trying to design. And I feel this is one thing that, from my own experience, we never really focused on. We focused on the entrepreneurship and the innovation in itself, and whether the idea was working, whether there was any IP, and talking about all that business modeling and business development stuff that most of us are aware of, without actually addressing some of these more sensitive, more human, more real issues. And we kind of need to do that as hubs because we are aware of the circumstances and the environment in which these founders are sort of operating in. Now, when we look at the key ingredients in developing a model, right, I identified these 5 specific issues. The first being qualitative selection. So whom are you letting into your program? And maybe more specifically, have you clearly defined the kind of startups that you are trying to get into your program? Yes, initially you can use that basic formula that we talked about in terms of whether it's sector agnostic or focusing on a particular sector, whether it's at a particular stage, but refining that and, more importantly, communicating that clarity in your call for applications so that you get the right kind of participants that match the content, the resources, and the intended outputs that you have in your particular program. Developing and adopting the right curriculum, and I'll touch on this one, I think, on the next slide as well. But curriculum development is actually very costly, and it takes up a lot of resources to get to that point. And I think, given the way that we have started to explore the ecosystem, even at a continent-wide level, that there are a lot of frameworks and methodologies and things that we can adopt, contextualize, or alter to fit our context, and then apply in our programs. That way, we spend less time trying to figure out, what methodology or what tools we should include, and we focus more on how those tools are helping the startups get through this process. It's one thing to simply say, here's a business plan template, can you just complete it, right? And it's a totally different sort of experience of taking that entrepreneur through that tool to understand whether the business is viable, what analysis is and what it actually means, not just copying and pasting the threads and opportunities that are there. I especially love talking about this from the context of the business model canvas, which is something that a lot of us talk about. It's kind of like common knowledge. But when you use that tool and go through it with a couple of entrepreneurs, half the time you find that they simply copy the example text that's there and simply just replicate that, because they're not particularly understanding what this tool really is about. They understand that they need to do this in order to progress in the program, and if there's funding at the very end, that's even worse. They're just doing it to get through it. And so we need to be able to focus more on how applicable these frameworks are to the work that we're doing. Mapping the program value chain. A lot of us develop programs, and we really don't focus on what else exists in the ecosystem. In fact, half the time we look at all those other programs as some form of competition, right? It's a land grab for program participants, especially when you get those rockstar startups that are coming out of whatever ideation program. I know I used to really get touched about this. You spend so much time helping these guys a whole year refine their idea, and they get to a place where they're getting out there, the media loves them, and all of a sudden everybody wants them in their program. And I would look there and I would say, but why? These people are supposed to be in our program. They're my people, type of thing. And this was a couple of years ago, so I can talk about it now. But you see, there is more value in understanding what value chain, what ecosystem exists, even at the program level, We talk about ecosystem development, collaboration with hubs, at hub level, at a community level, let's do events together. But it's also important to figure out whether there are sort of key integrations of different programs, and I'll touch on this as well. Building a robust chest of resources. I love having a chest of resources because I always say the kind of resources that we are able to get and how unique they are kind of become our unique selling point in our program. As a hub, as a program manager, as a program, an incubation program, you need to be the plug for something in your ecosystem. And this sort of lies in making sure that you've mapped out the stakeholders that are important. So if you're running a fintech program, make sure that you are connected with the larger ecosystem players in the fintech space. Make sure that your participants are able to leverage on you to get access to things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to, as individual organizations. And lastly, to build a community, so leveraging on your alumni. And I believe alumni are always willing to give back to a program that they found to be valuable. So if your program helped them get from point A to point C, D, E, they're going to be more than willing to come back and have conversations, maybe even take particular modules in your program to help contextualize that content. And it's always easier when it's coming from entrepreneurs. Half the time, in as much as we might be entrepreneurs ourselves as hub managers, we no longer see certain issues or elements from the same lens that the entrepreneurs are facing. And so having an entrepreneur who has gone through it, who's coming back and saying, guys, yes, we're talking about validation or this particular regulation in the industry, and they're talking about how they navigated it, that becomes way more valuable to your participants, as opposed to you coming down from Mount Olympus and dictating whatever steps to get there. Now, and at the end of this presentation, there is a list of links. One of the things that I started doing was trying to create a list, a spreadsheet of all these different frameworks, right? 2-3 weeks ago, as AfriLabs, we were talking about the Rollo platform, that was going to help, that is helping SMEs, test out ideas and strategies in risk-free environment. And I'm not sure if a lot of you knew about this, but AfriLabs actually developed a hub management course from the learning weeks of previous years, right? And I found this very, very interesting because I didn't attend a lot of those sessions back then, but a lot of that content is still very valuable to us right now. Now, the idea of doing this spreadsheet is to enable hub managers to not spend so much time trying to figure out which framework to use. And more importantly, it's something that I would want to develop to even include feedback from people who have used it. I know from previous, gatherings we've spoken about, Growth Will, my brother from South Africa always, pushes this program. And half the time we don't understand or we don't know how applicable the framework might be to our context. And so having hub managers who've used it, that becomes a lot easier. A lot of the programs that we get into also have content created, and sometimes they avail this to the open to the public. So as the TechVillage, we took part in the VILCAP program, and we're talking a lot about the investment readiness framework, the viral framework that they had. And I think it's just talked about as well in previous annual gatherings. And we actually took this framework and tried using it. And what I want to be able to do is to have a conversation with somebody else on this continent who's trying to use that framework to be part of their incubation model, to give them insight, to say, we used it, but these were kind of the issues that we kind of had with our, our participants. We had to change this part and that part. I believe that there are a lot of these frameworks. There's a lot of content out there, and I'd actually want to invite, everybody. I'll circulate a Google form via our Telegram group to say, if you have gone through a program, you have content or a curriculum or framework that you have used, feel free to add it to that spreadsheet, to that form, and I'll use that to populate this spreadsheet. So that at the end of the day, as a network, we have this very valuable resource that lists all the different types of content. And so that the next time you're trying to put together a proposal for funding an incubation model, or you're trying to develop a more specific program, you're essentially able to go through this entire spreadsheet and pick out the elements that you believe would be valuable and create a unique model. I think this would be valuable, and if you think it would be as well, please let's get in touch and curate it together. Now, when we talk about the chest of resources, the different resources that we can leverage on, you see, I love having this because it simplifies a lot in terms of the value that you're trying to create as a program manager or as a hub. You see, and I've broken these down into 4 different areas. So you have technical tools, things like AWS credits, and we actually got into the AWS program via AfriLabs as well, which was great because now we're able to give all of our participants up to, I think when we started it was like $3,000 worth of computing credits, valid for 2 years. And I can tell you that our participants found this immeasurably valuable, right? So getting into the TechVillage program, you immediately get that amount worth of computing resources, without which that startup was going to spend real money to try and get that resource. So that this increases kind of the value of your program from the perspective of your participants. So in terms of services, so I know a couple of us, and we're kind of going through a process of restructuring our operations to take some of our back office work, so our accounting, our HR, our legal services, and turn them into services for our participants, right? And this might be at a discounted cost, but it enables us to also kind of generate revenue from that. And so if a startup is looking at this and saying, look, going through this program, I'm actually going to get access to X, Y, and Z, administrative services that will help me figure out what this looks like. I know in our ecosystem, one of the things that startups struggle with the most is payroll and the taxation that comes with that payroll. And so if we're able to develop that as a service, then this becomes an immeasurable resource to the startup. They're able to focus more on their product and their service and less on figuring out the administrative and legal issues around trying to build a company. The third being infrastructure. And I think for those more specialized sectors, this is a very, very big issue, right? Our payment APIs are available to your entrepreneurs. Half the time, it's difficult. And when we were doing that program, and I know I talked about it quite a bit, when we were doing that program for that MNO, that corporate funded incubation program, what they wanted was they wanted more people to use their API, their mobile money API. But they didn't want to go through the cost of verifying whether a startup or an SME was legally registered and met all their requirements for getting access to the API. They, however, were very free to give us this API, and then we gave access to the startups and the SMEs. So they were happy because we were de-risking that entire endeavor, reducing the cost of it, whilst availing something that was very critical at the time to the startups that were trying to develop their own products and services. So being able to understand, and figure out those core resources that are part of your infrastructure and availing those in your program becomes something that is very, very valuable to the startups that you're trying to support in your incubation model. And then lastly, your access to networks. So we've had people applying to our program and being very honest that, look, we're applying to this program because we know that you all work with bank ABC. There's actually a bank called ABC as well. You work with a particular bank, and we want access to that bank. I know in one other example, we actually helped a logistics startup that was part of our program get a very flexible insurance service with an insurance company, simply because we facilitated that conversation, that relationship. And so having all of this as information that you're conveying to your program participants becomes invaluable, and it helps to build a more robust, more effective incubation model that ultimately helps them get to market and become successful. The whole notion around access and networks really relies on the brand currency and reputation that you are able to sort of garner as a hub, as an ASO in your ecosystem. And being able to use that currency is a very, very important and very powerful tool. It is, however, a double-edged sword. In that you also need to make sure that the startups that you're making introductions for are real and progressive and are at a stage where they are ready for that kind of conversation. Because if you then do that and partners begin to work with you based on your credibility, and those startups then don't pan out, that sort of backfires and eats away at the credibility that you've developed as a hub and as an ESO. And this is kind of why that storytelling that I always talk about and I'll touch on again is kind of like really, really important. Now, we also have a chest of resources, and this is kind of just an example of what we used to provide as the TechVillage. At the end of the presentation of the slides, I also added a link to a new sort of spreadsheet that I'm populating. And again, it would be great if we're able to populate all of these resources as a community, because a lot of them are just out there. It's free credits, AWS credits, it's free Facebook credits for marketing. But also some resources are very unique to your country. So, for example, we provide localized domain names, so co.zw domain names, and that is a resource that hubs that are in our ecosystem might want to be able to leverage on. but it might not be as applicable to partners or hubs that are in different countries. But again, this is something that definitely we should have a conversation about and begin to populate as a core resource, as a network of hubs and ESOs. Now, the incubation value chain. So understanding where you get your startups is very, very key. So where are they coming from? And I know a lot of us add this question at the end of our application forms. Where did you hear us from, right? And I'm not sure whether we actually utilize that data that we get from questions like that. But the reason why I feel it's important to understand that is, we've gotten to a point where we could go to a particular ideation program, an organization that runs workshops on this. And we're able to say, can you guys also include 1, 2, 3 things in your content? Because that kind of helps us when we take startups that are coming from your programs. And this is basically hub to hub or program to program feedback in terms of making sure that we're carrying a startup from point A to point B to point C in a way that enables them to have the capacity that we need for them to be able to scale. Without doing that, you then end up developing an incubation program, assuming that startups know certain things, and then realizing that they don't, and having to add that as curricular or as content in your program. And then more importantly, understanding what I like to call long-term support. So because running programs is by extension building communities of startups, you kind of want to know what happens to them after this program, especially when the program is funded. When the funding ends, you close the program, you're going to move on to the next program. But you're building an ecosystem, a community. So being able to identify where these participants can go is a very valuable sort of element, and more importantly, being able to build linkages to say, if you're coming from our program or being a part of our incubation model, you automatically get membership in this SME association or in this particular industry association. That becomes a perk to your program for participants, but also a way to make sure that you can hand off your participants into newer and more sort of established programs that appeal to the level that they're at. And I think this is very, very important because it makes the tracking of certain data very, very important. And I'll touch on this on, I think, the next slide. And I know, we're kind of running out of time. But one of the things that I've begun to struggle with, and we're seeing this in our ecosystem, is a lot of startups are basically going from one program to the next and to the next and to the next, primarily because they're looking for money. And a lot of these programs are donor funded, so they're NGOs or social enterprise organizations that are running pitch competitions and this and that. And if you really look at it, it's Startup X that is in this one program in 2017. In 2018, they're pitching for another $5,000 for the same problem and for the same sort of areas of capacity that they're trying to get in. And these pitchpreneurs are doing this because for them, this has become the easiest way of getting capital, right? Whether or not they're using that capital to grow the startup in the first place is a different conversation. But if we were existing in an ecosystem where we were able to map out participants that are in program X and how they move into the next program, I believe that would be something that is very, very important, and it goes into our measuring of impact. So if you're able to say, upon receiving applications for your program, you identify that this particular startup was in a program, an ideation program that was run by somebody else, and if you're in a position where you could get the data and the metrics around that, that becomes, I think, a more effective way of assessing opportunities and awarding capital in that framework. If you were running a pitch competition and you knew that this particular startup was in a different pitch competition in that very same year, being able to understand what issues were being addressed, in that competition and how they used that money that they got to get to the next place would help us to build a more progressive ecosystem, where startups move from that type of funding to seed stage type funding to raising an actual funding round. Whereas right now, our ecosystem is fragmented. And again, this is hypothetical, it's theoretical, right? But can we do that? Can we as ecosystems begin to make sure that the data that we aggregate on specific startups becomes shareable? And again, when you're talking about data, you have privacy issues, you have confidentiality issues. So it's again identifying specific elements, specific metrics that are measured from one program to the next and to the next. And again, making this clear to program participants that we will share or we might share this specific data to additional programs, or maybe even requiring their approval to do that. I think our data management, our privacy and confidentiality sort of issues are articulated in a lot of conversations that we have. But my question, and maybe what I'm sort of hypothesizing in this case, is being able to do that. And the basis of being able to do this would be to identify key sets of metrics that we can track across an entire ecosystem. And again, the reason for doing this would be to make sure that our programs can be benchmarked. So how is our agtech, incubation model performing against the one being run by Bongo Hive in Zambia or by mHub in Malawi? And being able to understand and qualitatively look at the value that we are proposing to these startups. And again, reducing this pitchpreneurship that we've begun to see across the ecosystem. I think there is the opportunity to do something like this, to implement something like this at local ecosystem level, and it's certainly something that we would be looking at doing. And again, this becomes important because even after you hand off startups into associations, you can then still check those metrics 3, 4, 5 years after your program. And most of us want to be able to talk about that, to say, our program participants within a 2-year or a 3-year period went on to raise X amount of money or went on to do X, Y, and Z. And the only way that we could easily get that data without hounding them and forcing our M&A team to be tracking down people is making sure that as an ecosystem, as ecosystem partners, we've mapped out this value chain and we're able to talk to each other about data, about program participants, and about building an ecosystem that actually works. Because at the end of the day, if you get participants that were successful from an ideation program and they get into your program, the probability that they will come out of your program as success is higher. And if you're handing them over to an acceleration program, then the probability that they will be successful in that program also becomes higher. And this is one of the core ideas that I was playing around with. Last 2 or 3 slides. The storytelling around our programs. Now, I believe when it comes to incubation models, our storytelling is broken down into 3, right? Telling the stories and marketing the program itself, right? And understanding why we're running this program. And then secondly, storytelling for the startups, for the participants that we have, because they need that marketing, that visibility, right? And thirdly, doing a lot of your impact storytelling, which is valuable when you're now trying to, propose a new program or attract more funding or resources, or whatever it is that you need for your future projects. And I think that the easiest way to create this hype machine is very simple. It's identifying who these ecosystem storytellers are. So whether it's your blogs, your news sites, and also what kind of content that they talk about, what kind of content they push on their platform. Secondly, building a network of these storytellers and delivering value to them. So asking them what kind of stories they're interested in, what kind of angles that they're exploring, and seeing whether you can match that given the startups and the activities that you're doing. And where possible, also paying for some of their services. So you want to push out a press release, instead of asking them to do it for free, kind of pay for that. That helps to create a relationship in which the stories that you want to tell are then also told. Build the tools for gathering that information. So don't make it a whole job for them to tell the story. Create a Google form, send it to your startups. The form is asking very specific questions. The form is asking very specific questions, and you're able to use that form to gather the information and give that to whoever is generating the particular stories. Use your own media assets. So yes, use your own blog, use your own social media, and if that doesn't work, build your own site. And this is one of the things that we've done, because we realize that some of the stories that we want to tell don't appeal to traditional or to mainstream media, right? I know the one time when we were launching it was a co-working space, the local papers basically came through and they ended up calling us an app, right? Which made no sense, but it was because we didn't avail the information in a structured way, in a very clear way, for that journalist to then articulate that story. And yeah, now we're building a platform called VentureNation.Africa and trying to use that to tell the not so sexy stories about our ecosystem, the stories that are not going to drive 100,000 viewers to an article, but are stories that we need to tell in order to build the ecosystem. So this is kind of the end of my presentation. There are a couple of resources that I think you should check out. The chest of resources is there. It's something that I'm going to continuously populate. It's not complete right now, so probably there are like 10, 20 entries that are there. Same goes for the learning and content frameworks as well. These are spreadsheets and you'll have access to them. But more importantly, I will share forms for those who want to add to these spreadsheets, so that they become a very real, living resource within the network for anybody who wants to develop an incubation model or whatever other program that you're working on as a hub. I think by doing this, because none of us own the frameworks that we're talking about, it's a matter of figuring out how to create the right mix of content, frameworks, and resources that help you build out your unique selling point, your unique value that you're proposing to both the startups and participants in your programs, as well as your funders, your donors, and your stakeholders. I hope this was helpful, and I know that the topic of incubation is so big and so dynamic, and it's also a conversation that we need to continuously have as we go forward. Thank you guys for being part of this presentation. Here are my contact details. I'm available on WhatsApp, email. We can definitely have conversations around some of these issues. If you have better ideas, better ways of looking at models, let's definitely have those conversations, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Takunda. This was quite insightful, and this is really interesting. Okay, it's now time for Q&A. Please type in your questions on the chat box. Want to use this opportunity to thank our sponsors, AFD and Digital Africa, for the opportunity to have these sessions, and also want to remind us that there would be another session at 1 p.m. GMT for our Francophone community. Takunda, while we wait for questions, right, you mentioned, and yeah, everyone is asking about the link to the Excel sheet. So I think you can just type it in, the link to the Excel sheet, so that we get a lot of people to contribute. I believe that's a very interesting idea, because getting people to contribute to this pool of knowledge, and it helps that whole, it actually encourages Ubuntu, like we're not isolated. So you just know that there's always that Excel sheet where you have pool of resources to different methodologies. I want you now to give like a practical example. You mentioned different ones, but which exactly has worked for you over the years? Like off the top of your head, this is one of your best. This is one of the best frameworks you always like going with. I would want to hear more about that while we wait for other people to send in their questions.
Sure. So in terms of frameworks, the honest truth is what we have done and what we have found to work is to take elements from multiple frameworks, right? So, and maybe to create a curriculum based on different tools and content that we find out there. So whenever we're trying to run an incubation program or model, we create an actual curriculum, right? Say 10 modules, whatever it is. And these are always linked to what we're trying to achieve, right? So we want our startups to understand whether they're fundable or not. Great. Let's go and look at the viral framework, right? But if you try and use the framework as it is, sometimes there are challenges. So you need to then create your supplementary content to make that framework make sense, right? You look at making sure that you're able to develop actual effective visioning and strategy for your organization. So we look at the POEM framework that Tommy Davis developed and talked about on Medium, right? And we look at that and we try and get particular elements of that and infuse them in the kind of work that we're doing. Because what we realized at the very beginning, and what we saw in other programs as well, was that people simply just take this is the BCG framework, right, done by the Boston Consulting Group. This is how it works. Identify a star, identify this, and that. And they theoretically sort of talk about it. And there's a very big disconnect between that content and what the entrepreneur is kind of facing. And so figuring out how to twist this, how to not focus on this element and focus on that element. The business model canvas, right? We spend the greater part of our ideation sort of session focusing purely on the value proposition segment and the customer segment, because that's your product market fit, right? And we always stress that everything else on that canvas kind of follows these two things. Whereas if it's used in its theoretical sense, they end up spending so much time trying to figure out what channels are, what relationships, these are things that are not even very core to the process of ideation in itself. That's kind of how we've figured out how to do it. And it's also because we are entrepreneurs, so I've been in the process of building a startup. And if you aren't and you're coming from academia or from a corporate space, then it makes more sense to bring in entrepreneurs who are building startups and saying to them, look, is this thing useful? And how do you use it? And then trying to build value from that perspective.
Thank you so much. We have a question for you, Takunda. Do you want to read it out or should I read it out? So it's from Val, and he says, how do I organize an incubation program for entrepreneurs in the creative media industry? most of these entrepreneurs don't run their business as startups. They run it as freelancers or one-man team. How do I get support for them to make them investable?
Sure. There's a conversation that we had about running and supporting, innovators or entrepreneurs whose growth curve is not the hockey stick, right? So they start and they're really just looking at building value and doing whatever they do within that context. And freelancers kind of, fall in that space. I think to create an incubation program for entrepreneurs in the creative media or freelancers, it's kind of looking at what those freelancers actually need, right? So do they understand where they're getting jobs? Do they understand how to invoice work? Do they understand the legalities of doing work? And this is one thing that I know freelancers always struggle with. You hear the stories on Twitter about how developer X did work and was never paid, or this person wrote content or took photos, and then those photos were being used in so many other publications because they don't understand what contractual rights they have and how to even create a legal contract. So it's looking at those specific issues to say, let's address the issues that they have. Because again, if we theorize and we say, I think they need more help in being visible, and we do an entire program that focuses on marketability and visibility without addressing the core issues that they have, they will participate in the program. But if you're using revenue, for example, as a metric, you won't find that indicator going up. They're still going to be earning whatever they were earning before. So it's really sitting down and doing what we teach startups to do, to say, let's go and understand what is the problem. Let's validate the problem. Let's get 10 freelancers in the room and let's have them lead a conversation, or take them through that conversation of understanding what their problems are. What are the challenges as a freelancer? Because we might not be freelancers ourselves. So they get to give you the challenges that they're facing. And then your job becomes to match those challenges with content, with program, with tools, and with support that helps them to solve those problems. If you solve their real problems, they are able to then generate more revenue to do better as freelancers. And I think that would then be a successful incubation program.
That's great. You have another question, and it's a question from George. It says, I find it odd to charge for an incubation program. How can one garner a partner to work with, or how can one make an incubation program sustainable since there is finance involved? And I think this issue cuts across different hubs. A lot of them really find it hard to really charge for incubation programs. So I know a lot of people would want to know what your response to this is. And you can cite practical examples, yeah.
And to be honest,
I want to hear all about that.
And we are one of those hubs that struggled with this whole thing, right? Yeah. We ran programs for free. I was just like, why should I charge someone for a BMC? I mean, it's online, right? Just download. And now I'm charging them for something that is free. It felt like I was conning them, right? Conning these young entrepreneurs that don't have money, shame. They're also trying to build a startup and they don't have money. And now I'm charging them for money for the service. I think it's in two ways. Firstly, it's trying to figure out whether you can find somebody else who's interested in funding the program, right? So you want to support startups that are in the agricultural space, right? Are there organizations who have PR budgets that want to be seen to be doing cool things with startups, right? In your taxation, are there tax breaks for doing things like that? And so you can take that angle of trying to fundraise elsewhere to fund your program. If not, and that is also difficult because as ESOs, as hubs, that means you need to market, set up meetings, pitch, and it's complicated. If not, then try and distill the value that is coming from your program. So I'm not charging people for the business model canvas, the template. I can tell them, go and download it. What I'm charging them for is the contextualization of the tool. To say, look, this tool is available, all these things are available. But what I'm saying is I will help you to structure them and to use the value proposition canvas and the business model canvas together to build an actual business. And at the end of the session, they should be able to walk out and say, fam, that was valuable. And one good way of testing this out, I know it's something that Kudzi by our treasurer from IHUB, has done quite a bit, because she's doing a lot of financial literacy. And I remember I used to attend the sessions, and she would say, it was online, it was on Zoom, and she would say, send me money for a cup of coffee, right? And whether she was doing that for fun or to validate whether that content, people were willing to pay for that content, I think it was a really ingenious way of evaluating whether your content is valuable or not. I mean, you can also build your own tools, right? You understand what taxation is like in your country. So build a tool that helps your entrepreneurs to calculate their taxation. You understand what legally should be on a pay slip or a pay advice slip in your country, right? Build it, add the percentages, pay as you earn is this percentage, this is a spreadsheet, it's a calculator, and you sell that tool, because then that is something that is delivering real value to them. I think that's the two ways, and certainly that's kind of what we're looking at now ourselves, to say, is there real value in this? Okay, are you all willing to pay for this value? Great, how much? And maybe that becomes a contributory income. So I mean, we can't charge them the whole $300 for being in our program. But if they can pay, $30 in for specific tools, templates, etc., then that becomes contributory revenue towards sustaining our activities, especially if it is a bootstrapped program. We can then go to a partner and say, look, we want to do a bit of advertising, or do you want to do advertising, or do you want your logo there? You're no longer asking $10,000, asking for $10,000, and also you're no longer as desperate for their money. You now have ground to stand and say, look, I can pay for my 2 program managers. It's fine. Now I need more money because I need to pay for those 3 experts and to make revenue for my organization. So now let's go and look for revenue. Because trying to negotiate for financing and funding when you're broke and you're desperate for it, it's hard and it's crashing. Yeah.
I kept using desperate for it because, man, when you're really desperate for it, I think somehow you don't even see the bigger picture. We have a question, and I think I would ask that question, so let it be the last question for today. Before we close, you just drop in your email address and your WhatsApp number for those that want to reach out to you, and also the link to the Excel sheet so that everybody would have, because people are asking of it. So the question is, how can we adapt our incubation program from physical to virtual? Now, adding to that, right, with COVID came the whole shift from physical to virtual, right? And then also there's always that thing about quality control for the kind of startups people incubate. But then now that it's virtual, I believe it gets harder. So in answering the question of adapting from physical to virtual, also we want your insight on how do you control the quality of startups? Because now you're not seeing the startups, you're more or less, it's like an online coach involved. How do you ensure that, I'm telling you my market product is, maybe I'm selling this one online or something, right? And I'm telling you this product is viable. Like, how can hubs ensure that, and ensure that from transitioning to virtual, they don't slack on the quality of startups they keep incubating? So yeah, that's my question.
Sure. And I think even to add to that, so recently we were running an incubation program for green enterprises, and a good number of them are semi-rural, right? So it's worse because, they're in places where it's hard to get them and how to reach to them. I think from a quality perspective, it's focusing on your minimum metrics, right? This incubation program, we want startups that are generating X amount in revenue, right? That's the minimum. And the problem with using metrics is it kind of feels like, it's so hard, because now all the hundreds of startups that you're getting, only 10 are meeting that requirement. But that's kind of the reality of your ecosystem. So you can either do one of two things. You can ignore the metrics and have 20 people in your cohort, and have the numbers that are competing with cohorts in Kenya and Nigeria. Or you can be real about it. You say, look, we're running an ag tech incubation program, and there are only 5 participants in the program, simply because you have been very specific in terms of the metrics that you're looking for. And when I say metrics, it's your data points, right, that you're asking them. And if they're applying, you should be able to ask those questions and maybe validate them once they get into your program. But it doesn't mean that you then chase everybody away. And that's the reason I was talking about that model value chain. Because then if you're also running an ideation program, it's redirecting them to say, sorry, we don't feel that you should be in this program. However, we're running a 4-week ideation program that will kind of help you address this. Or we're running a 2-week, formalize your business workshop, right? It's 2 sessions. And you need to go through that first before you come into our program. In fact, being so selective in our programs helps to increase the quality of the work that we're doing. The unfortunate thing is we are in part trying to save the world and make the world a better place, while also trying to deliver real value. And sometimes we kind of need to be very realistic in that. In terms of moving to virtual, in terms of and capacity for them to participate, one of the things that we've had to do was effectively add to the budgeting of that, and these are for funded programs, giving them a data allocation, right? And literally sending them airtime and data for them to participate in some of these things. Maybe not the whole thing, because they also need to show commitment to the programs. And that even works better if they're paying for part of the component of it. The second part is making sure that that content is also available offline. So in as much as they can't come to our auditorium for us to do the session, they're able to, just get the Zoom recording on WhatsApp and have a 2-hour discussion, in a WhatsApp group about the presentation that was made by that particular person. So figuring out how to sort of adapt and modify these things, I think, is kind of where the solution is. You know your participants best. For some participants, simply doing it virtual, it's easy, they're already doing it. For others, it's not. And so the way that you design the program has to be sensitive to that. I hope I answered both questions, but especially on the data and the metrics, this part is so important. We used to ignore these things. We'd be like, we like the idea, it's so nice, we really want them in our program. But at the back of that, being able to make sure that this nice idea, does it meet the pre-qualifications? If it doesn't, let's send it to a program to get to a point where it should get into our program. You hear about Y Combinator and 2% acceptance rate and all of these things.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the reason why they also get the funding, because a donor will be like, yeah, they are very rigorous in their selection. We kind of want to be in that. But it's, because we are not just for the money, being able to reroute these people to programs and activities, even within the hub, that help them to get ready for these opportunities makes more sense.
That's great. So I mentioned that was the last question, but I guess there's a follow-up question to that, and I want to ask it because it's still in line with what you're saying, and this is from Ibrahim, right? Now, he said this question has to do with the selection process for courts, which you were talking about. Now, but what he mentioned that is interesting, and I want to bring to light is there's a thin line between startups and SMEs, and we face that a whole lot, really, in the African ecosystem, especially with the applicants that sign up for programs, right? Now, how do you find the right startups into the incubation program? You mentioned Y Combinators and co and 2% this thing, but I don't believe they face that issue like we do about SMEs and startups and that demarcation, because even so now you have to still go further down the line to explain. So I would want to, and I know everyone is interested in seeing how you respond to Ibrahim's question. So yeah, that's why I say it's a follow-up question.
Okay, so let me get this straight. The question is about the differentiation between startups and SMEs?
Yeah, so there is a thin line between startups and SMEs, especially with the applicants that signed up for program. How do we find the right startups into the incubation program? So that's what we want to find out.
Okay, so the first thing that I would say is your program focusing on innovation development? So are you looking at the innovative solution and your curriculum is focused on that, right? Or are you focusing on enterprise creation, so the business side of things? Because I feel that the biggest differentiation between startups and SMEs, startups are small to medium enterprises. It's simply that startups try to focus on the innovation. Their existence requires an innovative or inventive step, whereas SMEs are taking advantage of an almost existent or existing opportunity. So you need to look at your curriculum as the first point. Are you developing a program that focuses on, let's focus on your innovation and how to make sure that your innovation is ready for market, and that's where your content is? Or are you focusing on, let's build the business and make the business sustainable and make money? And that's kind of where the focus is. That focus then tells you whom you are getting into your program. Because then you can't take an SME that's focusing on buying and selling and making sure that they are making profit and are sustainable, and you get them and put them in an innovative program where now they are bending over backwards try and figure out how they are being innovative in buying and selling vegetables, or moving FMCG goods, right? So it firstly comes from what your target is in your program, and then secondly, where to then.
Okay, so he mentioned that, just to follow up, they are focusing on ideation/innovation and establishing the business protocols for market entry.
Sorry?
They are focusing on ideation/innovation and establishing business protocols for market entry. Yeah.
Okay, so if you're focusing on ideation and innovation, then it's not even a question around SMEs, because your focus is very, very specific. When NGOs call for business plan competitions or implementers, you are not them. That's not your focus. You are looking at what technology is there, what IP is there, and all of these things. And more importantly, if you're focusing on ideation and running an ideation program as well, then that program should be the thing that generates the startups for your incubation model. So making sure that you have an ideation program that creates startups that can feed into your incubation program. Because having an incubation program that is in ideation, it becomes a very long program. It means you're focusing on, is your idea good enough? Let's validate the idea. Then you're trying to move from there. You're going to start talking about, how do you build a team? How do we get to market? These are two very different things. And programs that are broad-based and not specific enough tend to be difficult to define whether they're successful or not. You get 30 people coming into an ideation program, and it's 4 weeks, and it's great. But you only get 10 or 7 getting to a place where they actually have an idea that's getting to a market. And we know it's difficult to get an idea, a good idea that actually works in the market, because not all ideas can become startups. So I think being able to separate these two, using one as a lead generator for your next one, is better.
Okay, thank you so much, Takunda. And yeah, this brings us to the end of the session. We actually are shooting by 6 minutes, so we're going to use the next 4 minutes to wrap up. Thank you so much, Takunda. This is really an insightful session. Please, as I'm talking, just type in your email address and the link to the Excel sheet on the chat box so that people would get it. I really don't want to receive threatening emails if you don't send it in. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. As I said, this was sponsored by our sponsors at AFD and Digital Africa. And then we have another session in the next 53 minutes for our Francophone community. That will be facilitated by Paul Ivan from Engineer City and moderated by Rahel Chuku, who is the Francophone Engagement Officer of AfriLabs. So please do well to refer your friends in the Francophone community. Oh, I forgot to mention that for AfriLabs members, for everybody you refer to join the Learning Week, it kind of adds up to your membership credits. We are actually taking traction of that or taking note of that. So yes, Takunda, do you have any final words before we kind of round up?
Sure. So I was just sharing the links to the chat. Again, like I said, the spreadsheets are right now very early entry, so there aren't a lot of entries that are there. But if you can check by end of week, next week, and etc., we'll constantly be adding things to those spreadsheets. So just be mindful of that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Takunda. Thank you, everyone. And we're looking forward to seeing you same time tomorrow. Because of seeing you at today's section in the afternoon, and also same time tomorrow. So yeah, do have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Bye.